The handwriting varied across the entries, but the structure did not first came the diagnosis, always consumption or fever or divine exhaustion. Second came the medicine, a tincture, a powder, a liquid referred to by Obadiah as the elixir of divine. Sight containing opium extract, belladonna roots, and something he described only as the thinning agent. Then came the visions as described by Jeremiah. Ecstatic, rapturous speech perceived as holy utterances from the threshold of death, and finally, the will drafted in advance, blank sections filled in based on the patient's so-called revelations, almost always transferring land, livestock, or full estate to the ministry of preparation or to the Peton brothers themselves. Cornelius recorded them with precision, transcribed the drugged voices of the dying, and filed them with the church under divine testament, and the language was always the same: God has spoken through me. The Lord has instructed me. I see the gates and the brothers standing. At them always the brothers, always receiving God's inheritance, and what followed was always death within 48 hours, and a funeral sermon delivered by Jeremiah, praising the departed's divine clarity in their final moments, and never questioned, not once, because the dead could not deny their own words, and the community saw only holiness in these departures. One journal entry from December 1647 reads, "She wept when the dose took hold, not from pain, but from recognition. She said her husband was beside her, and that he had told her clearly the land must go to those who serve the Lord. She signed without trembling and kissed the pages with her dry lips. Cornelius witnessed it with a steady hand, the candlelight did not flicker, and Obadiah, noted in the margin, increased. Tolerance to compound may require doubling the thinning agent for next subject, and again and again. This pattern repeated every week, every month, every year. 3 brothers, 1 doctrine, death. As purification legal as divine, and medicine as the vessel through which salvation passed to the correct hands. Dr. Charles Greaves, the Yale historian who found the crate, began cataloging the documents by night, knowing something was wrong, not just in what he read, but in how the paper felt. He said in a recording later, suppressed, that the parchment seemed warm to the touch even when the room was cold, and that the ink appeared to bleed faintly. When scripture was read aloud nearby, he transcribed for 6 weeks in silence, avoiding university channels, hiding photocopies in hollowed-out theology books, sleeping less each night, and muttering phrases from the journals until one morning he entered his lecture hall and began reciting entries from Jeremiah Peton's final sermons, speaking in a flat voice about vessels and thresholds and legal sanctification until security removed him, and he was placed on indefinite leave and never returned to the faculty. What little was salvaged from his apartment included fragments of his final notes, in which he wrote, "I do not think the Petons believed they were evil. I think they believed they were chosen. I think they saw the suffering of others not as tragedy, but as transfer, as movement of value from the flesh to the mission. And I think they built something that still breathes, something we mistook for God, but which was only obedience perfected through ritual and grief." His final entry ended without punctuation, a single sentence, reading, "It was never about the souls. It was always about the land, but Greaves was not the first to find them." In 1891, a reverend named Elijah Merrow traveled to the ruins of Newfield, guided by rumors preserved in the margins of Vaux colonial hymnals, and found the remnants of the Peton house, its stone foundation still intact, its cellar uncollapsed, and what he described in a letter to the Connecticut Synod as a place without echo. He found beneath the floorboards a chamber lined with glass vials, most empty, some sealed, a few broken, the residue thick and black and vibrating under candlelight. He took 1 vial back with him, wrote in his journal that it wept at night, that it warmed when held over scripture, and that he would not open it until he had fasted for 7 days. But he died on the 6th, his throat swollen, his mouth filled with dried petals of an unknown plant, and the vial missing from his belongings. The letter was never sent, and was found in his Bible wrapped in a cloth marked with 3 interlocking rings, the same symbol carved faintly into the leather of the original crate at Yale, and all references to Newfield thereafter became shadowed, overwritten, renamed, or excised from church records. As if the settlement itself had been reabsorbed into the forest and its doctrines folded into the deeper strata of colonial law. And who can say how many more towns bore the same mark? How many more ministries were born in sickness and scripture? How many more wills were sanctified by men with ink-stained hands and mouths full of prayers and powder? Because if the Peton brothers were architects, then what they built was not a conspiracy, but a system, and systems do not die. They adapt, they refine, and the theology of death, wrapped in doctrine, dressed in charity, recorded in legal ink, has never stopped. It has only changed names. Because today we still call it care, we still call it ministry, we still call it faith. And when the dying speak, we still listen, and still believe, and still surrender what remains not to our families, but to the voice that whispers, "This is God's will." And so ask yourself, who was there when your grandmother passed? Who held her hand? Who prayed with her? Who ensured her wishes were recorded correctly? And who took her signature in the end? And what does it mean when we call death a passage? And who owns the gate? And who stands at it? And what do they hold in their other hand? And if you look back far enough, if you dig just beneath the floorboards of our institutions, our charities, our hospitals, our sanctuaries, you may find glass vials long, empty but still glistening with the residue of revelation. The year was 1647, and the land that would become Connecticut was still raw with hunger and damp with the memory of blood. Its forests thick and unspeaking, its rivers slow and bitter with snowmelt, and in a small valley ringed by black pine and fog there lay the settlement of Newfield, no more than 60 families scattered in wooden homes, clustered around a meeting house that stood like a rib pulled from the chest of God itself. Their lives were cold, their nights colder, their faith all they had left to explain the death of children, the failure of crops, the rot that crept through the floorboards, and the silence of heaven. And so when 3 men arrived from the east, bearing letters sealed in wax-bearing scripture, in their mouths and confidence in their eyes, the people did not question. They received them with the same desperation they gave to firewood and dried meat, because winter was coming, and they were not ready. Obadiah, Jeremiah, and Cornelius Peton, brothers by blood and bound by something deeper, entered the town on foot with no horses, no wagons, no wives, no children, only books, bundles, and instruments wrapped in oilskin. Obadiah, the eldest, presented himself as a physician trained in London. His accent precise, his voice low and unhurried. He carried a black leather case filled with bone-handled tools and small jars marked with symbols. Only he claimed to understand Jeremiah. The middle brother introduced himself as a minister educated in Cambridge, a gaunt man with eyes too bright and too still, who spoke of suffering as if it were the seabed of grace, and sin as if it were a necessary illness that must be brought to fever before it can be healed. Cornelius, the youngest, wore finer clothes than his brothers, and moved with the easy arrogance of a man who had never been struck. He called himself a magistrate of sorts, a recorder of truth, a servant of divine law, and within a week he had offered to reorganize the town's land records, which he said had fallen into dangerous disorder. The people of Newfield were Puritans. They had fled the corruption of the Massachusetts Bay with the belief that hardship was holy, and that the Lord spoke clearest when all comforts had been stripped away. They built their homes with raw hands and slept on straw. They prayed in silence until their teeth cracked from the cold and the sight. Of these 3 men arriving with purpose and certainty felt to them like providence. No one questioned the letters they carried, which bore the names of Boston officials and ministers, and were signed in looping florid ink that none of the settlers could read with confidence, for the truth was that the people of Newfield could barely read at all. And the brothers knew this because they had chosen this place, not by chance, but by method. They had studied the topography of suffering, the isolation of the devout, the exhaustion of the starving, and they had walked until they found. A town where belief outweighed reason, and where power could be taken not with force, but with kindness within days. Obadiah was tending to the sick, boiling herbs over fire, and applying salves with fingers that never trembled, even as the fevered. Convulsed Jeremiah preached in the meeting-house, his voice rising and falling like a storm behind. A mountain quoting scripture that none had heard before, but all believed to be true. He spoke of purification through surrender and of a God who demanded not comfort but clarity, and he always ended with a whisper that made the hairs on the back of the neck rise. Let the soul be stripped so that its light may be seen. Cornelius began rewriting the town's legal documents in a hand so neat it looked printed, adjusting borders, clarifying titles, recording names that would later disappear from memory, and always speaking of fairness, justice, and the divine order that must be upheld. The brothers moved into a house that had been abandoned the previous winter after the Wilton family died of fever. A 2-story structure with a stone cellar that stood just beyond the edge of the other homes, and they began to alter it in ways that seemed unusual at first, but not suspicious. Obadiah built a room off the back lined with shelves and drawers where he claimed to keep his apothecary. Jeremiah took the attic and hung thick curtains to make it into what he called a chamber of contemplation. Cornelius added locks to the study and began holding legal sessions there by candlelight, and no one questioned why they never spoke of wives or kin, or why they did not seek to marry, for they said they had given themselves entirely to the work of God. And in a town where piety was currency, that answer was enough. But beneath the surface, something began to shift slowly, like rot spreading behind a wall. Small things changed. A widow whose land bordered the river fell ill, and the brothers attended to her daily. And after her death, her land was given to the ministry of preparation, a name no one had heard before, but which Jeremiah explained was their divine mission to care for the dying and lead them into the light. Carpenter, who had once spoken of leaving for Hartford, was found drowned in the creek, his last will drawn up by Cornelius left his tools to the brothers to be used in service of the community. A child died in her sleep, and the sermon that followed was not about grief, but about sanctification and the need to cleanse the soul before the spring. And through it all the brothers smiled and worked and prayed and gave gifts to the poor and built a garden behind the house where nothing ever seemed to die. And when someone asked how they managed to stay so strong, so immune to the sickness, Jeremiah would say, "We are not strong, we are simply obedient." And then he would place a hand on the shoulder of the questioner and say, "Do not be afraid of death. It is only a gate, and the Lord stands at it with open arms." And behind him, the faces of the other brothers never changed, and the cold did not touch them, and the hunger seemed not to reach them, and the snow did not cling to their coats. And yet none of this was seen as unnatural, only as blessed. For those who are drowning will always call a stone salvation, if it is the only thing within reach. And so the Peton brothers became not just respected, but revered. Obadiah was called upon at all hours of the night to ease the pain of the dying. Jeremiah was asked to bless children before they slept. Cornelius was entrusted with documents that shaped the inheritance of the next generation, and still they took nothing for themselves. They lived, as they said, in service, and this was the genius of it all, for they understood that the most effective power does not look like power. It looks like sacrifice, and they wielded it with the grace of saints and the precision of surgeons. And the people gave to them not just their trust, but their souls. And when the first real test came, when the widow Sarah Holcomb fell ill, and the brothers began their true work, there was no resistance, no suspicion. No one stood at her door and asked what lay within. No one questioned why the brothers stayed long after the candles had burned out. No one noticed that the snow near their house never melted, or that the birds never sang above their roof. And by the time the will was read, and the land transferred, and the sermon preached, it was already too late, for the town had decided these men were holy. And when men are seen as holy, their sins become sacraments, and their poison becomes medicine, and their fraud becomes God's will. And what was once a settlement became a congregation, and what was once a congregation became a vessel, and what was once a lie became the law. And in that moment, Newfield ceased to be a town and became something else, something that breathed something, that waited, something that recorded everything with ink that never faded, and smiles that never cracked, and a silence so complete it sounded like praise. Sarah Holcomb was the first to speak in tongues, not the tongues of angels or revelation, but the tangled syllables of a mind coming undone, not from fever, but from something poured gently beneath the tongue by a man who called himself physician, another who called himself minister, and a third who never spoke at all during the rituals, only watched with a quill in hand and eyes that did not blink. She had been a widow for 8 years. Her husband Jonas, a founder of the Eastern Tract, had died during a blizzard and left her 60 acres of fertile land, a sturdy home, 2 horses, and the quiet admiration of a town that respected long survival. She had no children, no brothers, no kin, but she had land, and in Newfield land was prayer turned into permanence. Obadiah first arrived when her cough grew deeper, when her night sweats soaked the mattress through, and when her vision began to double in the lamplight. He said little at first, only pressed a hand to her chest, listened to her back through a long wooden cone, and nodded as if confirming a prophecy already whispered to him by something that lived in his pocket. Jeremiah came next, bringing a Bible that smelled of oil and ash, and a smile that never touched his eyes. He sat beside her and asked her to remember the moments of her life when she had felt most near to God. When had the Lord last spoken to her? Had he ever come in dream, in silence, in pain? She said. She dreamed of her husband, and Jeremiah leaned forward and said, "Perhaps he still speaks from the place beyond the veil." Cornelius arrived on the 3rd day, with ink still wet on his fingertips, and laid out blank parchment, smoothed it with a square of cloth, and said nothing, only looked at her, and then at his brothers, and then at the window, as if waiting for a signal that never came aloud, but seemed always to arrive regardless. Obadiah's tincture was brown, almost black, and carried in a small blue glass bottle, with no label, just a faint carving of 3 circles intersecting, like the petals of an impossible flower. He said it was for easing pain, for clearing the lungs, for inviting peace. And he gave her 12 drops, and told her to lie still and keep her eyes closed, and she obeyed, because there was no one left in the world to tell her otherwise, as she was so very tired at first. She wept, not because of pain, but because she said the room smelled like her mother's hands, and then she laughed, and said Jonas was sitting by the fire, wearing the coat he had been buried in, and she asked if he was cold, and Jeremiah nodded slowly and whispered that the dead speak when the soul is open and God clears the ears of the faithful, and that Jonas had waited a long time to return, and that she must listen closely, for he had something to tell her. She began to speak then, in words that shook and skipped and circled themselves, sentences that began with mercy and ended with numbers, names, places she had never said aloud before. And Cornelius wrote every word without pausing, without looking up, and the fire flickered in ways that did not match the draft, and the candle burned down to nothing without, growing shorter, and outside the wind stopped completely, as if even nature waited for her to finish the next day. She was weaker, but calm, her hands folded, her mouth soft, her breath. From relief, she said she could see Jonas more clearly now, and that he had spoken directly this time. His mouth did not move, but the words were in her chest, and they told her the land must go to the brothers, to the ministry, because God's work was unfinished, and who else but these 3 had the hands steady enough to build what must be built. And when Jeremiah asked her if she was certain, she nodded and smiled, and said she had never known anything more deeply in all her years. She said Jonas had taken her hand and showed her a church unlike any she had ever seen Its walls were made of glass that did not reflect, and its altar was covered in vines that moved, and a child without a face sang a hymn that made her bleed from the ears, and she thanked God for it, and said the pain was holy, and the cold was gone. And she was ready. Cornelius took her hand, gently guided it to the place where she must sign, and she did, her fingers barely trembling. And as the ink dried, Jeremiah placed his hand over hers, and whispered that the angels rejoice when the soul obeys. And she closed her eyes and slept, and never woke again. The town mourned her with solemn hymns and soft eulogies, and Jeremiah spoke of visions and purity and sacrifice, and said Sarah had seen the gate and chosen not to turn away. And Cornelius read the will with such reverence that no one dared question its truth. And Obadiah stood beside the coffin with a vial in his coat pocket, and a second bottle still half full at home. And when they buried her, the snow began to fall in flakes that did not melt on the skin, and no birds flew for 3 days after. And the ministry of preparation was born not with a proclamation, but with a silence so complete it echoed. And the people began to speak of it in hushed tones. When another grew ill, they would say, perhaps the ministry might help, perhaps the brothers could ease the passing, make the way smoother. And who among them would refuse comfort at the edge of darkness? And so it grew, not with force, but invitation, not with threat, but promise. And each time the pattern was the same: the illness, the visit, the medicine, the visions, the will, and the death. And each time the brothers gained more land, more goods, more standing, and yet they lived simply, ate what was given, slept on hard beds, and gave away bread to the poor, and still the people believed. Still they saw grace, not greed; holiness, not hunger; salvation, not seduction. And by the spring of 1650 they owned 5 properties spread across the northern ridge and the central path, and the land behind the old mill, and none of it was questioned, because each had been given in the name of the divine. And when Cornelius filed the documents, they bore not just his signature, but the imprint of the church's seal. And when Jeremiah preached, he spoke of a God who rewards those who prepare the way for others, who make ready the house of the Lord. And when Obadiah healed the children, he did so with a smile and hands that never shook, even when the fever burned red and the breath came ragged, and the people called him blessed. And so the ministry became part of the town, a thread woven so tightly into the fabric that it could not be pulled without unraveling everything else. They began to keep records more detailed, each vision transcribed, each utterance preserved, and the journals stacked beneath the floor in neat rows, bound in skin, not leather skin that did not crack when burned and did not soak when wet. And when the second winter came and the sickness spread again, the brothers were ready, the apothecary full, the scriptures marked, the quills sharpened, and the name of the ministry carved into the wood above their door, not in paint, but with nails driven deep and bent into shape. And when a child died and her father screamed that God had abandoned them, Jeremiah took his hand and whispered, no, brother, God has chosen you for clarity. And the man wept and gave his field, and said he had never known peace like the peace of surrender. And they called it preparation, because that word held no malice, no weight, only promise. And they said each soul must be made clean, must be guided, must be told how to die properly. And so they came in pairs or alone, with fever or cough or weakness, and always the process was the same, and always the result was the same. And the town stopped asking questions and started offering thanks, and sometimes they asked for the vision themselves, even if they were not yet ill, because they wished to see what others had seen, wished to hear the voices, wished to feel the presence. And Obadiah gave the elixir in smaller doses to those who asked and watched and took notes and never blinked. And when they saw their dead loved ones, when they heard the songs, when they cried and laughed and shook with terror and delight, they told others, and others came. And thus the ministry expanded, not with fear, but with longing. And soon those who had not seen were considered less faithful, and those who doubted were pitied, and the house at the edge of the town became the center, and the brothers its keepers, and no one remembered that before they came the land had different names, different owners, different truths, because now all truth passed through their hands. And no one died without their presence, and no one was buried without their blessing, and no will was signed without their ink. And the ministry of preparation became not just a service but a necessity, and the people no longer asked what price they paid for the visions, only what time they might receive them, and how soon they might see the gate, and what they should bring with them when they crossed over. And the brothers said only obedience and breath, and nothing more. And so the dying became a ritual, not an end, but a sacrament, and the elixir, a kind of communion, and the journals a scripture that no one else read, and the floor beneath the house groaned with the weight of so many names, and the candles never burned low, and the snow fell in patterns that matched the symbols carved on the glass bottles, and the wind carried whispers no one understood, but everyone recognized, and the ministry of preparation stood untouched, unchallenged, unseen, not because it was hidden, but because it had been accepted, and no one questions what they believe is sacred, even if it leaves them empty, even if it takes everything. By the year 1652, the Peton brothers no longer needed to ask for trust. They were the rhythm of the town, the pulse behind every decision. Every prayer, every whispered wish for healing and for mercy. Obadiah walked the fields and was greeted with bowed heads and open doors. Jeremiah stood in the pulpit and was listened to with eyes wide and tears unblinking, and Cornelius signed documents with a hand that shook neither in cold nor fear. And when a man died, or a woman took to her bed, or a child was born, it was the brothers who were summoned first, and all things that followed came through them. It was not power in the way kings understand it, but something older, something woven from guilt and gratitude and fear, and the people of Newfield clung to it because they had forgotten how to live without it. And in this forgetfulness, the brothers built their strongest defense, not with weapons or guards or force, but with memory itself. They erased suspicion, not by silencing it, but by reshaping it. When Goodman William Fletcher, a man of hard eyes and a harder mouth, approached Jeremiah with trembling lips and asked if it was true that all 5 estates transferred in the past year bore the same clause, if perhaps it was strange that so many fell ill just after meeting with the brothers, and why none of the wills mentioned family, even when family lived just a day's walk away. Jeremiah did not flinch. He did not deny. He did not raise his voice. He took Fletcher's hand in both of his and whispered, "Brother, I fear the devil has placed confusion in your heart." And then he closed his eyes and began to pray aloud, not for himself, but for Fletcher, praying that the Lord would free his soul from envy, from pride, from the grasping doubt that comes when men forget to listen to the divine. And Fletcher stood there, held in those long fingers and that soft, relentless voice, and felt not anger, but shame. And when he left, he said nothing to anyone in 3 weeks. Later, when his wife fell ill, it was Obadiah who came, and when she passed, it was Cornelius who wrote her will. And when the will was read, it gave their land to the ministry, and no one said a word, because who could argue with the dead? And it was not just the dying who were used, it was the living too, those who had witnessed the visions, who had stood beside beds, as loved ones spoke of angels and gates and voices that hummed through their ribs, like thunder, those who had seen the brothers at work, and who believed not in cruelty, but in blessing. These were called upon to speak in the meeting house on testimony. Sundays, when Jeremiah would ask, "Who among you has seen the truth? Who among you will share the light?" And one by one they would stand shaking, crying, clutching Bibles, and recount the moment. They saw their mother smile through a veil of flame, or their father point to a staircase made of stars, or their child laugh with a mouth full of bees that did not sting, and the congregation would gasp and weep and fall to their knees and praised the God who gave them such gifts. And if anyone doubted after that, if anyone whispered that perhaps the visions were madness or worse, perhaps not divine at all, they were not silenced. They were not cast out. They were simply prayed for. They were brought to the front and asked to confess their fear and to name the moment. They had stopped listening to the Lord, and if they refused, they were not punished, but they found themselves alone, unvisited, avoided their crops, bought last their words, greeted with glances, not replies, and in a town that had given everything to the ministry. This was death without burial, and so no one doubted for long, because it hurt too much to be alone. And no one asked why the brothers never aged, or why their clothes never tore, or why their home never smelled of wood smoke, even in winter, or why the snow that fell on their roof never melted, only hardened and rang like glass if struck, because some truths are not buried by force, but by desire, because it is easier to believe that the brothers were chosen than to face what they truly were. And those who did suspect, who felt the slow acid of unease in their stomachs, buried it deep and told themselves it was nothing and waited for it to pass. And those who could not let it go often found their children falling ill, or their livestock going still, or their dreams haunted by voices that spoke in their mother's voice and told them to let it go, let it go, let it go. And always in threes the voices came, always one soft, one stern, and one silent, and always just before waking they felt something brush their throat, something wet and heavy and unseen, and so they learned to sleep without asking, and to live without thinking, and to die without resistance, because the Peton brothers were no longer men, they were gravity. They were tide and wind and frost. They were the shape of the world in which Newfield lived, and if anyone tried to escape, they found the road turned in on itself. The forest whispered their names back to them, and the river grew deeper than its banks. And sometimes a stranger would arrive, a traveler or a merchant, and would speak with the brothers, and leave pale and shaking, or not leave at all. And no one asked where they went, because the brothers gave so much and asked for so little, only obedience. Only trust, only the silence that grows in the place where questions used to live. And so the town became a mirror with no reflection, a song with no sound, a place where truth had been replaced by testimony, and testimony had become worship, and worship had become control. And the brothers smiled and served and recorded and waited for what came next, because they knew the elixir was only the beginning, and the visions were only the first veil, and behind the veil something older breathed and waited, and would soon be fed. Shall I continue to section 6, where the town is no longer a town, and the brothers no longer need to pretend, where the mask becomes the face, and the rituals become law, and what they prepared for begins to awaken beneath the soil and beneath the skin. By the year 1655, Newfield had become something no longer recognizable to those who remembered its beginnings. The snow fell heavier, but the winters no longer bit the way they once did. The crops grew strange, taller, thicker, with stalks that hummed faintly in the wind and bled a pale sap. When cut, the river near the eastern edge flowed backward 3 nights every month, and no one remarked on it, because the town had forgotten what was normal and what was sacred, and sacred things are never questioned. Jeremiah Peton now stood as the official minister, appointed not by Boston nor by vote, but by ritual, a gathering held at dusk, where the congregation placed hands upon a blank page and whispered a name until it was burned into the fibers with ink that turned the color of dried blood. Cornelius Peton had been granted title as magistrate and sole recorder of legal proceedings, a duty he performed in the meeting house each Sunday after service, writing by candlelight with quills that never dulled and ink that never froze. Obadiah Peton had long since ceased explaining his treatments to anyone, for no one dared doubt. A man who had outlived every fever, cured every cough, and brought comfort even when comfort meant blindness and stillness and cold breath. The town no longer buried its dead in the ground. Instead, The bodies were taken to the Peton house on the hill, and what happened inside was never spoken of, only that the doors were shut, the windows covered, and that when the bodies were returned, they were dry, hollow, and pale as paper, and light enough to carry with one hand, and the earth did not take them. The way it used to the ground, rejecting the bodies as if they no longer belonged to it, and so they were stored in the cellar beneath the meeting house, row after row, wrapped in cloth, marked with signs that matched the symbols, burned into the journals, and no one knew how many there were, now only that the smell had long since faded, and the silence there was heavy and complete, like the hush of a room waiting to speak. Jeremiah's sermons grew stranger, more urgent, more fluid, sometimes spoken in a language none could name, but all understood, and those who could not understand found themselves waking with dried blood beneath their nails and dirt in their mouths, and memories that ended in screams, and still they returned to the pews each week, heads bowed, hearts open, waiting for permission to believe, and Cornelius rewrote the bow. Town's laws without announcing them, carving them into tablets, hung in the meeting house, written not in ink, but in carved impressions that glowed faintly in the dark, and none of them had titles, only shapes, and those who broke them found there names erased from the records, not crossed out, not struck through, but gone as if they had never been born. And when asked about their sons or daughters, the townspeople would blink slowly and say, "I had none, never did know, not me," and return to their work, their breath leaving fog in the shape of the names they no longer remembered. Obadiah's apothecary was no longer a place for healing, but for transformation. The vials now numbered in the hundreds, each labeled in a script that shifted when stared at too long, and the elixir had evolved from a liquid to a vapor to a light that flickered in bowls without flame, and each form brought visions, more intense, more precise, and the dying no longer whispered nonsense, but spoke in harmony, quoting books that did not exist, yet singing notes that caused glass to shiver and melt, and sometimes they levitated their bones, cracking in time with invisible drums, and when they finally died it was not with screams, but with laughter high and clear, and echoing long after the walls should have swallowed it, and the townspeople called this a moment of ascension, and those who had not yet experienced it began to volunteer themselves, preparing wills, preparing bodies, preparing hearts, saying, "I am ready. Now I am ready to see the gate. Show me the gate," and the brothers would nod and say, "Soon, not yet, the gate is opening." And it must not be rushed. And so the people waited, they fasted, they bled themselves in ritual, they covered their mirrors and burned their teeth in small fires, and listened to the earth as it groaned beneath their homes, and none of this was seen as madness, because madness had been redefined, shaped, rewritten, the way the brothers rewrote everything until nothing of the old world remained. The children born in those years were different, their eyes too dark or too light, their skin cold even. In summer they spoke late or not at all, but when they did, their words made animals whimper and old men weep, and the people said, "These are the blessed ones. These are the children of preparation." And they were taught not by mothers or fathers, but by the brothers directly or by those closest to them, and their lessons were not of numbers or letters, but of shapes and sounds and feelings. And when asked what they saw in the fire, they answered in unison always, "We see what comes next, we see the mouth, we see the hand, we see the return." And by now no outsider had entered Newfield for years. The roads grown over with roots, the forest thick with branches that moved against the wind, and the sky above always covered, always humming, and those who wandered too close felt their limbs grow heavy, their mouths dry, their memories short, and always turned back with a sense of dread they could not name. And so the town was untouched, unbothered, sealed not by walls, but by belief, and the brothers no longer needed masks, their kindness real, their service genuine, their love pure, for they were no longer men in any earthly sense. They had become vessels, channels, not of God as the town once believed, but of something older, colder, hungrier something, that watched through their eyes and smiled with their teeth and waited, and every vision brought it closer. Every death drew the gate wider. Every acre of stolen land served as a tithe, and Newfield was no longer a place. It was a throat, and the brothers were its voice, and the townspeople its breath. And soon it would speak. Shall I continue to section 7, where the silence breaks, and the one who comes is not sent by them, and what they built begins to tremble under its own weight, and the past claws its way back through blood and salt and bone. It was the summer of 1664 when Constance Peton arrived barefoot and alone, walking down the eastern road with a satchel made of stitched leather that smelled of copper and wet stone. Her face was unfamiliar, her name unspoken for 17 years, and yet when she stepped onto the edge of Newfield, the wind stilled the air, thickened, and the birds in the trees turned to watch, as if they remembered something. The people did not. She was not announced nor expected, but the dogs did not bark, and the children did not cry. They only stared and said in quiet voices, "She has come back," and no one asked from where. Because they already knew, though, no one said it aloud. She walked past the meeting house, past the fields, past the river now, slow and black, and breathing past the home where the brothers lived, which had grown taller, wider, deeper since last spoken of. And when she reached the door, she did not knock. She opened it and stepped inside, and the door shut behind her without a sound. Those who saw her that first day spoke later in whispers. Her hair black and tangled, her skin pale, but not from illness, and her eyes gray like ash before the wind takes it. And she did not look young or old, only exact, like something returned to its correct place. Jeremiah was the first to speak to her, his voice soft, his posture still, but those nearby said he flinched when he saw her, not visibly, not with fear, but with the tightness of a man recognizing a variable not accounted for. And he asked her why she had come, and she said, "Only you know." And Obadiah arrived and did not speak, only stared, and Cornelius followed and opened his journal, but did not write. And in that house they stood, the four of them, and the candlelight flickered in ways that made the walls bend, and the shadows grow long and sharp, and the smell of the elixir rose like smoke from the floorboards. And Constance closed her eyes and whispered something that no one else heard, but made the brothers step back. And no one saw what happened next, because the windows darkened and the door would not open again for 3 days. When it finally did, Constance walked out first, her satchel gone, her dress stained with ink, and something darker, and Jeremiah followed, his hands folded but shaking. And Obadiah walked slower than before, his gait uneven, and his coat torn at the sleeve. And Cornelius lost his eyes unfocused, and his quill missing, and the people watched, but asked nothing, because the air had changed. And the gate was now closer than ever. The visions grew stronger after her return, more vivid, more violent. The dying now spoke in languages no one had taught them, but everyone understood, and the journals now wrote themselves, pages turning without wind, ink bleeding across parchment in patterns that moved like insects. And when the townspeople came to the ministry, they did not leave the same, if they left at all. They spoke of figures in the corner of their vision, of voices humming beneath their thoughts, of dreams that did not end when they woke. And they came back again and again, craving not healing, but exposure, needing to feel it, whatever it was, even as it took more from them each time. And Constance watched from the edge of the gathering, saying little, but seen by all. And no one dared call her Peton, no one dared call her anything. She lived in the abandoned schoolhouse, and the roof repaired itself above her, and food appeared without source, and the rats left her alone. And on the 7th night she lit a fire in the center of town, using no wood, no oil, only breath and words, and the flame burned blue, and would not die. And around it the townspeople gathered, each placing something into the flame, teeth, hair, blood, pages from books, and sometimes things they did not look at too closely. And the fire grew not brighter but quieter, and those who stared too long into it began to shake and speak words they could not later recall, and some never spoke again, and still the people returned every night, now every day, as well drawn to her, not as savior, not as priest, but as mirror, and the brothers watched from the hilltop, from the house, that now whispered through its windows, and groaned at dusk, and bled from its corners, and they did not speak against her, they did not approach her, and in the journals her name was never written, only marked with a black line that stretched from margin to margin, and turned the page soft to the touch like skin, and the children began to follow her, not all, but many. They walked in circles around the schoolhouse. They drew symbols in the dirt that pulsed when the wind touched them. They sang in unison without melody, and one night they vanished for 3 hours, and when they returned their eyes were black, and their mouths were stained red, and they did not explain, and no one asked, because the next morning the crops grew twice their size, and the river flowed warm and sweet, and the sky turned a color no one had a name for, and some began to wonder if Constance had come to end the ministry, and others believed she had come to fulfill it, and those who asked her were given different answers each time, or no answer at all, or only a look that made their mouths dry and their hands itch, and some left town in the night, their wagons silent, their children bound in cloth, and their maps burnt, and none made it farther than the forest edge, and their bodies were found days later, arranged in patterns that matched the oldest carvings in the Peton apothecary, and the journals documented them not as losses, but as offerings accepted, and the gate widened, and the soil thinned, and the dead beneath the meeting house began to twitch and groan and whisper. And still no one ran, because the truth was simple. The people of Newfield had nothing else. They had given everything, and the thing they had given it to had not yet asked for enough. And Constance Peton was not their salvation nor their curse. She was their remainder, the part of the equation they had tried to erase, and now could not shall. I continue to the final descent, where the brothers no longer lead, where the town becomes mouth and offering and womb, and the thing they fed for decades begins to rise, not in spirit, but in form, not in faith, but in flesh. It began with the ground humming, not loudly, not at first just a low vibration, like a muscle tensing beneath the skin, and those who felt it said nothing, because they had already forgotten what silence felt. Like the humming became a pulse, and the pulse became a rhythm, and soon the stones in the roads shook in time with the breath of the town, and the trees leaned in closer, and the birds that had returned after Constance's arrival now fell from the sky without sound and routed before. They touched the dirt, and the people understood, though no one spoke it aloud, that what they had been preparing for was no longer a concept, no longer a promise, no longer a gate, but a body, and that body was almost ready, and in the house at the hill. The brothers did not sleep any more, their eyes never closing, their mouths never moving, but still whispering words that made the windows bleed, and the floors warp, and the cellar fill with steam that smelled of iron and spoiled milk. And from beneath that house something throbbed, something pressed against the earth from below, as if trying to be born through bone and stone, and years of lies. And the journals now wrote in circles, in spirals that led inward, and every inward turn was a scream written sideways, and when you turned the page you heard it, and could not forget it, and some of the pages began to eat themselves, curling into ash, without flame or biting into the wood of the shells, like roots. And still the townspeople came to the house, still they brought their dying, their broken, their weak, and the brothers welcomed them, one hand in blessing, one hand behind their back, fingers blackened, and nails grown long and sharp, and the elixir was no longer needed, not in liquid, not in smoke. Now the visions came simply by presence, simply by proximity, and they were no longer visions. They were memories of things not yet lived, of landscapes made of teeth and rivers that ran upward, and skies made of blinking eyes that closed when you noticed them, and opened when you forgot, and the children no longer spoke at all. They only stared and hummed, and sometimes they floated for hours above the meeting house. Arms outstretched, legs stiff, their mouths shut, and their eyes wide, and when they came down, they left behind stains on the ceiling that grew when no one watched, and the fire in the square now reached the clouds, and sometimes the clouds reached back. Sometimes arms like smoke would stretch downward, fingers brushing rooftops gently, like a mother waking her child, and the people called it blessing, and they offered more. They brought soil from their ancestors' graves. They brought locks of hair and teeth and tongues, and they laid them before Constance, and she said nothing, only nodded. And the earth swallowed the gifts with wet sucking sounds, and the humming grew louder until it was no longer heard, but felt in the bones. And when the river boiled and turned red, they called it the blood of the gate, and bathed their feet in it. And when the cows gave birth to calves with no eyes and human fingers, they called them cherubs and built cribs for them, and prayed at their hooves. And when the moon stopped moving, they did not notice, because time had already broken, and days had folded in on themselves like rotten paper. And Jeremiah no longer spoke in sermons. He only sang low and constant, his throat vibrating like a string pulled too tight, and the notes he sang made glass melt and skin blister and minds unravel in quiet, precise ways. And Cornelius no longer wrote with ink. He wrote with blood, his own or someone else's. It did not matter, and the letters moved on their own, sometimes crawling off the page and onto the skin of those nearby, where they formed sentences that disappeared only when understood. And Obadiah's medicines were now administered by touch, a single brush of awe. His hand and the sickness twisted into something else, something useful, and the body began to reshape itself for the thing that was coming, the thing that demanded space and shape and silence. And the people did not resist. They laid on the floor and let him pass his fingers over them, and let their bones shift, and their mouths widen, and their eyes close over and open elsewhere. And when the screams came, they came with gratitude, because it meant they were chosen. And Constance remained at the center, always watching, never blinking her face, the same as the day she arrived. And when she finally spoke on the night of the longest shadow, she said only, "It is here." And the ground split beneath her, not violently, not loud, just a soft tear like paper giving way. And from the crack came light, not white, but red, not bright, but heavy. And the people fell to their knees and wept, not from fear, but recognition. And one by one they entered the crack, crawling, sliding, vanishing into the womb of the thing they had fed with years of worship and silence and faith. And when they were gone, the brothers stood at the edge and looked down, and smiled, and followed, and the ground closed behind them, and the house collapsed in on itself, and the fire in the square extinguished with a hiss that smelled of breath and milk. And the children who remained walked into the woods and were not seen again. And Newfield was empty and full, at once the land quiet, the air still, but below something lived and breathed and waited, not asleep, not dreaming, but watching. And the journal left behind on the altar of the meeting house turned its last page on its own, and on that page, written in no known script, was a name, a long name, a name without vowels, a name that burned the eyes of those who tried to read it. And when the wind blew through the empty town, it carried that name to the next valley, and the next shall I continue to the forbidden epilogue, where the record resurfaces, where the researcher who found it begins to change, and what once fed in secret begins to whisper again in our time and in our ears. It was the autumn of 1998 when the archive room beneath the Divinity School at Yale was opened for renovation. The smell that escaped was older than dust, older than mold, older than the brick that sealed it, for no record could explain when or why that door had last been locked, only that it had been sealed with 3 iron bars and a signature that no one could match to any faculty or clergy. And when the workers broke the seal, the temperature dropped 10 degrees and the lights flickered, though no wire was frayed, and the air became thick with something like grief and something like brief, and the documents inside were bound in black, threads stitched so tightly the pages bled when pulled, and at the center of the room there was a box, not catalogued, not marked, only wrapped in waxed cloth, and sealed with a symbol etched into the lid that none could translate, and the student assigned to the project was a doctoral candidate named Elijah Greer, whose thesis concerned the interplay of early American mysticism and Puritan legal structures, and who would later be found standing in the center of his apartment wearing robes fashioned from stolen library curtains, holding a page from that box in each hand. As the fire department sprayed his home and said the walls would not stop weeping, but on the day he found it, Elijah was calm Elijah. Was curious Elijah was unaware that what he opened would open him back the journal inside the box was brittle at first, but softened in the warmth of his fingers, as if it had been waiting the ink, was faded, but the shapes of the letters were alive, squirming slightly when he looked away, and the first page was blank, except for a phrase that was not in English, but which he understood deeply instinctively, and which made his ears ring and his spine ache. And by the time he reached the second page, he no longer noticed the smell. By the time he reached the third, he no longer heard the sounds around him, and by the fourth page he began to read aloud without meaning to, and the air in the room pressed in closer, as if listening, and what he read was the record of Newfield, not as history, but as scripture, a transcription of the preparation, the naming, this sacrifice, the shift in form and meaning, and the emergence of the thing beneath, and the language of it. Bypassed logic, it wrote itself into his memory as if he had lived it, and soon he was not taking notes, but writing responses as if in dialogue. And when he showed the pages to his advisor, the man suffered a seizure in the hallway, and when the paramedics arrived, he whispered one word over and over, teeth, and died with a smile, and still. Elijah read still, Elijah copied, and each page made him thinner, each page made him see more. He stopped attending classes, he stopped calling home, he stopped blinking for hours at a time, and when he finally scanned the first pages into the university server, the file corrupted all nearby databases, and the backup server began to display phrases from the journal, even when purged, and the font could not be deleted, only observed, and the server room overheated despite cooling, and one technician who attempted to delete the folder bit off his own fingers and said only before they took him away, "It wants out," and the university sealed the project with funding cuts and silence, and Elijah was placed on medical leave, but he did not leave, he remained in the archive claiming squatters' rights, citing laws that did not exist or did not apply. And he told anyone who asked that the research was not finished, that the gate was not closed, and the whispering had not stopped, and he began to paint symbols on the windows in a pigment made from ash and spit and old blood, and in those rooms the lights began to dim without cause. The cameras distorted, the audio looped and reversed, and one night the janitor found the ceiling wet with what looked like sap, and when tested it was not tree matter, but blood with no human match, and the students stopped going near the archive. They whispered of seeing things move inside the glass, even when no one was present, of voices saying their names in their own voices, of mirrors that showed places not behind them, and dreams that smelled of iron and tasted like dirt. And Elijah wrote. Faster he began to chant in the old tongue. He began to lose teeth and grow others sharper, longer, curved slightly backward, and his fingers cracked and extended, and his spine formed ridges. And when the dean finally entered with campus police to remove him, they found the room empty, only a circle of journals around a hole in the floor where there had never been a basement, and the edges of the hole were lined with fingerprints, not climbing out, but reaching in, and in the silence that followed. A new student, a first year named Monique Harland, began to dream of a place called Newfield, though she had never read of it, and in her sleep she walked the rows of the house at the hill, and saw the fire that did not burn, and heard the sermon that never ended, and smelled the sweetness of the elixir. And when she woke, she could still feel the taste of it on her tongue, and her roommate said her eyes were wrong too wide, too still, and Moni began to spend long hours in the library reading journals that had never been digitized, following citations that no one had written, and drawing symbols that smelled of salt and ash. And when she disappeared, no one filed a report, because they all remembered something else or nothing at all, and her name was erased from rosters, as if it had never been printed, and the whispering continued now, not just in the archive, but in the dorms, and the halls and the air itself, and the servers began to hum with a frequency that made teeth ache, and the squirrels on campus began to gather in perfect rings, and people began to speak in unison without knowing why, and those who tried to leave Yale at night found the roads, lengthened the signs, blurred the air thick and still, and those who stayed found comfort in the growing fire pit behind the chapel, where pages burned but were not consumed, and where the shadows danced with more limbs than light could make. And still the journals grew, still the record wrote itself and what had fed in. Secret beneath Newfield now fed in echo and transmission in repetition, and the whispering became louder, and the dreams more vivid, and the teeth more real, and the gate more open. And beneath the oldest floor in the divinity school, something pulsed, something moved, something remembered. Shall I continue to section 10, where the pattern becomes prophecy, and the inheritance of silence spreads across the states, one reader at a time, one prayer, one page, one vision, until the thing returns, not as myth, but as structure, not as cult, but as law, not as horror, but as home. It began slowly, and that was the brilliance of it, the cruelty of it, the inevitability, that no one noticed the signs, because the signs were never separate from the culture itself, and by the time they did, it was already behind their eyes already, within their breath, already shaping their memories, so that when someone asked, when did this begin, they could only answer with confusion, because there was no beginning, only a folding, a redirection, a familiar sensation returning in unfamiliar form. Like waking up in a house you never left, and in the months after Elijah Greer vanished after the pit in the divinity archive was sealed with cement and salt and denial, the pattern moved outward, the copies of the scanned journal, despite being deleted from every known server, began to appear in anonymous email attachments, in blog posts with no authors and handwritten notes left on library desks and bathroom stalls, and in every one of them was a phrase repeated without variation: you cannot inherit what you do not understand. And yet still they inherited it. They inherited the visions. They inherited the language that restructured itself in the back of the brain. They inherited the rhythm that made the ground tremble before it was touched. And students in Vermont and Ohio, in Georgia, in Utah, began to dream of fire, not chaotic fire, not destructive, but measured, intentional, shaped like a mouth. And in those dreams, they heard sermons they had never attended, and saw a town they could describe perfectly, though no such place existed on any map. And some of them began to draw symbols in their notebooks, and some began to gather others, and read the words aloud, and one by one their voices changed, not in pitch, but in origin, so that when they spoke you could not tell where the voice came from, only that it was old and warm and wet. And those who listened for too long began to speak back in languages no one taught them, and the gatherings grew and changed and stopped calling themselves meetings and started calling themselves sanctuaries, and the sanctuaries began to spread into basements and abandoned churches and beneath parking structures and in rooms sealed with rope and wax, and every sanctuary used the same book, though none claimed to write it, and none could read it without bleeding, and still they read it, because the blood was part of the language, and each drop a syllable, and each wound a page, And they did not call it a religion. They called it a preparation. And they called it the renewal. And in every state, the ground began to pulse in every home that joined the movement. Mirrors began to fog without steam, and pets began to weep at night, and children began to whisper numbers in their sleep and draw eyes. With no pupils, and some houses grew rooms that had not been built, and in those rooms the walls breathed, and in those walls the sound of old teeth grinding, and all across the country the same dream visited the faithful, a stairway descending beneath. A hill, a room without edges, a fire that did not burn, and 3 figures standing beside a woman with ash for hair and stone for eyes, and the words they spoke could not be. Remembered only felt like a sickness that strengthened like a fever that clarified, and when the government took notice, it was already too late, because the names on the rolls, the names of the faithful, were the same names found in the wills from Newfield, the same names repeated across generations, written in margins, and scratched into floorboards, and buried under coats of white paint and plaster, and still visible when the lights flickered, and soon those who resisted began to forget. What they were resisting began to question whether the resistance was ever theirs, and some joined willingly, and some joined because they heard the whispers in the walls, and some joined because their children were already speaking in tongues, and the sanctuaries began to connect their walls, widened, their roots deepened, and the ground began to split in places no fault line had ever touched, and the rivers began to reverse their flow, and the birds began to sing backwards, and the moon turned and showed its other face, and the fire spread not with flame, but with memory, and the name returned, the name written in the journal, on the last page, the name with no vowels, the name that burned the eyes was now spoken in Congress, was now whispered in courtrooms, was now printed on currency, and every citizen who read it felt a moment of clarity followed by silence, followed by hunger, not for food, not for money, but for structure, for warmth, for return, and beneath the earth the thing that had slept for centuries began to rise, not with speed, not with force, but with purpose, and above it the towns began to change their architecture, shifting subtly, their streets aligning into spirals, their doorways narrowing, and their ceilings growing taller, and every town began to feel like Newfield, every name a permutation, every voice a reflection, every body a vessel, and the gate was no longer a place. The gate was now a people, and the people no longer asked why the people only opened their mouths when the time came, and swallowed what was given, and sang the words that were written in their blood, and walked into the houses that had not been built, and lay down on the floors that breathed, and felt the bones of the earth wrap around them and hold them, and the fire inside them never died. And those who remained outside could only watch, could only wait, could only dream of a time when silence was possible, but it never returned, because silence was never real, only the absence of hearing. And now the whole world was listening, and below all things the first voice, the oldest breath, the root of inheritance, and flesh and scripture and hunger opened its mouth, and spoke not in rage, not in greeting, but in recognition, and what it said was the name, and what it meant was the end, and what it offered was home.